This episode features David Dennis, a principal product manager at Microsoft who also owns a surfboard company in California. He pivoted from public school teacher to climbing the ranks in technology while building his own business and giving back to his community through philanthropy. He's also a TedX speaker who delivered the talk titled, "Don't Quit Your Day Job." In this episode, we discuss his journey and how it shaped his approach to careers and building a fulfilling life. If you enjoy it, please share with a friend or subscribe to my channel.
I don't tend to plan for my career, and that way when really interesting opportunities come up that I may have never thought of, I'm able to take advantage of them because I never really had a plan in the first place that I'm trying to stay on. My career has gone in some really cool directions that were completely unexpected.
I was wondering if there was a specific moment or period in your life where you discovered this approach and decided to adopt it, or if you somehow always subconsciously had this approach.
I think probably always subconsciously, because it goes along with not having a life plan, not really setting clear goals for what I want. And so I just let things come and take advantage of opportunities when they arise, if they seem interesting at the time. The one turning point was taking this photograph of a person who was unhoused in Santa Cruz, where I live, and had this idea that instead of just taking photos, which I'd love to do for fun, that I should use that for some common good. And that got me thinking about how I could take a passion and do something meaningful with it. And given that I work at Microsoft and we have this incredible giving program where they match employee donations and time volunteered, I could take advantage of what Microsoft was doing to amplify the good. And the photography work that I did, one of the projects I did was to support the Surfrider Foundation in Santa Cruz. And that led to this idea to do an eco-friendly surf company. So I'm just sort of open to things as they come. And as I was doing those things, I realized, hey, people shouldn't quit their day job to go follow their passion necessarily. They should try to integrate their various passions into how they live every day.
You talk a lot about doing good and giving back. Why is that important to you?
It's a good feeling. I don't know. I think about that a lot. Like, is it selfish to give back to other people? Like, are you really doing it because of the way it makes you feel? And I've come to the conclusion that maybe, but if you're helping other people, does that really matter? But really, the truth of the matter is that it was inspired by my parents, where my parents were always donating their time, giving money. They've been volunteers, docents at the Monterey Bay Aquarium for, more than 25 years. My dad works on the board of and helping do strategic planning for nonprofits, especially in environmental protection. And, my mom's been a volunteer at the aquarium and did work to help injured wildlife when we were young. And so it's just always been something they've done, and I learned that from them.
Would you say that your perspective and your approach to adopting multiple interests at once influenced your parenting?
I think so. I think, we've always encouraged our kids to do what they enjoyed, but also, not chase your passion to the point that you are homeless. You've got to make a living, and we've always, encouraged them to try and follow their passion, but, to make sure that they were also employed at the same time. But in terms of, we've done, part of it is this idea of not really clearly setting like absolute life goals allowed us as a family to take advantage together of all kinds of really interesting things. Like, I knew that I wanted to work overseas at some point, and an opportunity arose, even though it wasn't like a definitive life goal that I had to do it. An opportunity at Microsoft arose to go live and work in Spain for a couple of years. And so I did that, and I did that with the family. And then while we were there, we got the opportunity to travel all over the place. And we've always wanted our kids to see how they're privileged and how not everybody in the world lives like that. So we wanted to do a lot of travel with the kids so they could understand more holistically how the world works. We wanted them to see endangered animals, and we wanted them to do volunteer work. And so we've done some of that around the world as well. I think the way I approach things has influenced my parenting, and hopefully it's made our kids more well-rounded.
You described your work at Microsoft a little bit, and I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what you do there. But also on a higher level, I feel like, there's an obvious difference between what it takes to manage software products and what it takes to lead a surfboard supply company and pursue philanthropic photography. But I'm curious how these different pursuits have actually nourished each other.
That's an interesting question, and I could probably go on for hours on it. But the short version is I figured out how to integrate them all. So Microsoft supports philanthropic work through our giving program. Every $15,000 a year, up to $15,000 a year that we donate gets matched by Microsoft. They also pay $25 an hour for every hour we volunteer. So anything I do that's philanthropic, or anything that almost all of our employees, especially the U.S. employees, do that's philanthropic, Microsoft matches, Microsoft supports. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. Ventana, my surf company, was founded out of a photo exhibit. And so Microsoft was supporting the charity work that I did for that photo exhibit. I had this idea for the surf company when I was photographing surfboard shapers for this project. And so the surfboard company came out of a philanthropic project, and Microsoft was supporting that. Now, the other interesting thing is, as somebody who's got a small business, I've learned a lot about the different tools and the processes and the challenges and the risks of managing and running a small business, which has helped inform my work at Microsoft in a couple of different areas of places I've worked, projects I've worked on. For example, I worked on some small business strategy for Microsoft, and that was well informed by the work that I do at Ventana. So I could keep going and showing all the tentacles in between them, but they've all fed off each other, and they've all been, as you said, I think, nourishing each other through connections like I just described.
You've been saying yes to a lot of things in your life, and also just you've been initiating new things. Have there been times that you remember where you had to turn down an opportunity or deprioritize something that you were excited about?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't usually think like that. I do what I feel like doing or what I want to do, and I don't know. I mean, maybe I'd like to be surfing more often. Sometimes, all my different projects and work get in the way, although the swell isn't very good right now. So that, at least as of the last couple of days, it's not a big deal. But one of the, you said this, we were talking about, my wife and I and some friends at around New Year's about, okay, what do you want this coming year to be like? And mine was simplifying things and maybe saying no to more. And then I got a couple of emails, I think the next day, that were, hey, would you do a speaking engagement here? And would you teach a class here? And immediately I said, yes, yes, yes. So I have a really hard time saying no. But I generally am only asked to do things that are relevant to my areas of expertise. And so it's kind of fun to get out there. I used to be a school teacher, and I missed going out and teaching and educating people. And so it's always fun to do that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I mean, the short of it is I wish I could travel more. I wish I could surf more, but I do have a day job. And as you know, my TedX talk was don't quit your day job.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, it's interesting that you bring up your experience as a public school teacher, because I was actually curious how it played out that you transitioned from teaching in public schools to becoming a co-founder and then to moving on to working at Microsoft. As I kind of get to know you from these previous questions, I know that you didn't have like a huge plan in advance to do that, but I'm curious in real time how that played out and how you're able to market your past experiences in order to get into these more technical and business-oriented roles.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Silicon Valley. My father started two software companies, the first one in 1972, I think. And so he was super, super early in software, back before most people even knew what it was. And so I grew up, I like to say I grew up in the industry. I grew up down the street from Apple, and I think I had the same English teacher that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had. And so we just were all steeped in technology growing up because of, where we were. And my dad was an entrepreneur. So all our dinner table conversation was about business issues and challenges and, the economy and challenges with employees and having to lay people off when the economy took a big downturn and how painful that was. And so I just sort of grew up with that. I went into teaching because I met my wife when we were 21 at San Diego State, and I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I didn't really want to go into tech, or at least I thought I didn't. And she was going to be a teacher, and I didn't really have a plan. Like I talked about, I don't generally have a life plan, and she was going to teach, and it seemed like something that might be fun. So I said, all right, I'll be a teacher too. And I loved it. She and I, before we got married, moved out of the country and moved to Costa Rica so we could start our teaching careers there and improve our Spanish. And it's such a need to speak Spanish as a teacher here in California. But ultimately what happened was my wife stopped teaching to take care of our kids when our 2 kids were born. And we couldn't afford to live in Santa Cruz at the beach with a single teacher's salary. So I had started doing website development on the side for schools and school districts and county offices of education and that sort of thing, just to make extra money. And that was back in the early days of the internet in the early 90s when, doing website development was super easy. It was just, basic HTML. And that ultimately turned into a way to make more money than teaching. And so as much as I love teaching, I really had to leave in order for us to continue to have the lifestyle we wanted. And had some ideas for some new tech. The internet was starting to boom, and wound up starting a company that failed miserably, but built up enough experience to go to Microsoft. The reality of that, though, is that there was a little bit of nepotism in that one of my father's companies was acquired by another company, which was acquired by another company, and then became part of Microsoft because Microsoft acquired that larger entity. And I wound up joining the remnants of my father's company inside Microsoft. So I had a lot of experience from my work in, starting a business, but the introduction that I had to Microsoft was through people that my father knew that were the remnants of his company that became ultimately part of Microsoft. Mm-hmm. So I've been at Microsoft for 23 years. And in fact, I think 23 years next week. And I've always felt like I have to prove myself because I feel like I had a little bit of a backdoor into the company that, a political science master's is what I have from San Diego State University is not the kind of path that you'd expect to go into tech. The reality is I probably wouldn't have been hired had I not had a connection. You've got computer science from Brown. You're a perfect candidate. I wasn't. Mm-hmm. So I've been trying to prove myself ever since. And try to maybe shed some of that imposter syndrome.
I feel like imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people would experience for different reasons. I mean, for me, like I went into college at 24 years old. I served in the military for 5 years before starting college. And wow. I didn't really have any prior technical background. So I kind of felt like CS wasn't necessarily something that was intuitive for me, but I always felt like I have a chip on my shoulder and I kind of got to outwork people around me in order to make it past it. And I feel like, I don't know, like a lot of people just experience this irrespective of how justified it is for them to have imposter syndrome. So I am curious from your experience, given that you did eventually go into Microsoft and now like you've been at Microsoft for a while, were there any tangible like steps that you took that helped you overcome that imposter syndrome and transition in an effective manner at Microsoft and ultimately thrive and, make it into like these really impactful roles?
So there's a book called First Break All the Rules, which is one of my favorite books. It's by the Gallup organization. And it talks about focusing focusing on your strengths. It also talks about when you're managing a team, finding what each individual's strengths are and trying to put them into roles where they can take advantage of those strengths, as opposed to saying something like, well, you're not good in this area, this area, and this area, and we need to work on those areas. It's more, these are the 3 things you're great at. We're going to find a role for you where we can really take advantage of your strengths. So what I've tried to do is find roles and contribute in ways that are match my strengths. I've been in product development for a really long time at Microsoft, and my math skills are horrendous. Like I can't code. I can barely add 2 numbers together. And so I've had to find ways to add a whole bunch of value that is unrelated to the traditional sort of tech path. And so I've done things like, I'm really good at convincing people to do things. I'm really good at kind of internal evangelism and internal sales. I'm good at maybe looking at a bigger picture to help people understand why the work that I think we should do or that we're doing is meaningful for the company and for our customers. And so I've found ways they'll put me on things where they know that we need help convincing, say, other teams at Microsoft to do work on our behalf, which is one of the big things I'm working on right now the outlet team. So it's basically been trying to find ways to discover my strengths and put those into action in a world where I don't have some of the other traditional skills that maybe folks have in a tech role. The other thing I'd say about imposter syndrome, there's a lot of research that suggests that people who think they're imposters and who don't think they're qualified to do a job or qualified well enough relative to their peers are actually the ones that their peers judge as the best and the most qualified. Those that think that they're terrific and don't have imposter syndrome and feel like, they're super well qualified to do whatever role they're in, tend to be the ones that are judged more negatively by their peers. So there's some benefit, I'd say, to having that imposter syndrome because it makes you work harder. It kind of helps you identify some of your own issues and blind spots. And you generally are viewed by your peers as more confident and capable than you think you are. And I think that's one of the ways that I get through that challenge of having imposter syndrome. It's just remembering that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd also be curious to kind of check out the research that you're describing, but in general, I think it's really good to know about that. It's encouraging to hear that.
And the people that I work with that have military experience at Microsoft tend to be some of the most successful. We could probably spend an hour talking about why that is, but one of the people that I'm working with almost daily on some of our fraud issues, we have bad actors trying to do nefarious things with our services, comes from a military background, and he's one of the most effective employees I've ever worked with, and I've found that with others as well.
That's
so
awesome.
I think you're in a good position.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm definitely happy to hear that, and I have a lot of respect for fellow veterans. Some of the people I've interviewed for this podcast served in the military at different capacities. So yeah, I certainly respect people who served, and it's good to hear that I can kind of look forward to maybe leveraging some of what I learned in the military when I move into Microsoft.
Yeah, disciplined, hardworking, focused. I think it'll serve you well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And as you were talking about the value of finding your strengths, understanding them, and leveraging them, and also just in general, how having a non-traditional background in whatever setting you're in could be valuable. I was curious how that maybe connects to recruiting and someone in an interviewer position who needs to make a decision about who to accept into their team, whose resume to pick up. Do you have any opinions on how companies might be able to do a better job of identifying that someone might be a good candidate, even if they don't check all the boxes? Were you ever in a position as a leader where you were trying to make those judgment calls yourself?
I think so. One of the things that companies can do is just reach out to a much wider net. We used to only hire from the Ivy League, and we still hire a lot. You're a good example, but we reach out to a far more diverse set of universities than we used to. We also have a neurodiversity program. People with autism, as an example, often have very, very solid skills in one area or a couple of areas, and so we have a program to cast a much wider net of people, because all of our the Microsoft customers are as diverse as the world, because we've got billions of customers, and so having representation of that diversity in the company actually is smart from a business perspective. The other thing that I personally have done, and I don't manage teams anymore. I work remotely in Santa Cruz, and so it was challenging before COVID even. I was here to manage teams, and so I made the decision to become an individual contributor so I'd have a little more flexibility in where I lived and worked. Mm-hmm. But what I often do in the interview process is I may be interviewing somebody or helping an interview loop for another team, and I may be trying to interview for a specific role that they're interviewing for. But if I see that they've got skills in a different area, I'll often go back to the recruiter and say, I don't think this person, and we do this at Microsoft all the time, we call it hire for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. And it may be that they're not a hire for the role, but they've got some really, really interesting skills where they might be a hire for Microsoft and they might be somebody we want in a different type of role. So instead of just saying something like this person isn't a fit for the role, it's what are their strengths and can we leverage those elsewhere in the company? And I think that's an important way to look at interviewing.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. It's also encouraging to hear that interviewers kind of keep that in mind. And beyond that, it's a little bit tangentially related to all this, but it sounds like you have a really interesting relationship with the ocean. You surf, you have the Ventana surfboards, and sounds like you live by the ocean. How would you describe the relationship you have with the ocean, and like, when do you think it started and why has it been meaningful to you?
Yeah, so I'm not religious at all. And the ocean is sort of the closest thing I feel to, I guess, what some people feel with God or spirituality or whatever. Like, it's just such a mellow, calming place to be. But I think it started with, I grew up in the Silicon Valley. The cool kids all lived at the beach over in Santa Cruz. So there's a mountain between the Silicon Valley and Santa Cruz. And so we'd come over here when I was a kid and play at the beach. And it was always like, wow, the cool kids are over here. And I'm just a nerdy kid over in the tech center. So there was always this sort of like, the beach is cool. My parents decided when my brother and I were teenagers that they wanted to learn to scuba dive. So we got certified as scuba divers when I was 16. I think my brother was 14. And we used to travel and it was super privileged, right? I mean, most people don't have this kind of opportunity, and I'm totally aware of that. But being able to travel around the world and go scuba diving. And then in college, because I had diving experience, I became a dive instructor. So when I was 19 years old, I was a scuba diving instructor in San Diego while I was going to school. And I just found all these different ways to love the ocean, in some cases make money off the ocean. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's been super important to try and protect the ocean because it's given so much back to me. I didn't learn to surf until I was 40. Oh. My kids were 8 and 10, and I was 40, and my wife was 40, and she didn't really get into it, but my kids and I did. And so we had moved back to Santa Cruz. We knew we were going to stay here. We live near the beach, and I decided that we should all learn how to surf because we live here, and this is one of the surfing meccas, best places to surf in the world. So I learned how to surf at 40, and that was also part of the impetus for wanting to co-found Ventana, and it's all sort of worked together. But I love to snowboard. I love the snow as well, but there's something about the ocean that's one of my friends was a New York Times bestselling author named Jay Nichols, and he wrote a book called Blue Mind about the science of why the ocean and large bodies of water have a positive effect on the brain. And whatever that is definitely true for me.
That's awesome. I mean, I personally relate. I'm not a great surfer, but I do surf, especially when I get the chance to go to warmer climates. And I love it, and it's very enjoyable. So it's cool to hear how that's been part of your life. And it's also awesome to hear that you started on the later side, relatively, and that it's still something that you kind of adopted into your life.
I mean, honestly, if I had started at your age, I'd probably be living in a van at the beach somewhere or just traveling to warm climates and surfing, and I would have completely made different life choices. So it's probably good that I didn't, because I was sort of able to get quote unquote successful in my career before I started surfing. It's become a total addiction, and I'm glad. I wish I had started early, but it's probably a good thing that I didn't.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That actually brings up an interesting point, kind of makes me think of an interesting question. I know that for you, you have passions that are, I guess, more risky to pursue full-time. So if you were doing the photography full-time or being like an entrepreneur full-time, then there's some inherent risk to that. But then you have what you called your day job, a thriving career at Microsoft, which is objectively a little bit safer and more financially secure. Do you have some sort of formula or just like an abstract opinion about how to approach what to prioritize? If someone has a passion that is obviously like fruitful and financially secure, then that might be easy and a no-brainer. But if someone's passions are clearly on the more creative, artistic, and like less financially secure side, how do you kind of architect a life where you enable that passion to exist but minimize the risk, I guess?
One of the worst pieces of advice I think people are given is follow your passions. And if you can, the other one is, if you do what you love, or if your job is what you love, you'll never work a day in your life because it just feels like fun. If you can do that, that's great. Like, if you can make a job out of, my son has a band in Los Angeles. His name is Jacob Dennis, and he's playing shows, and it's a pop punk band. It's really super cool. He's also working at a music studio to make money, and he's trying to follow his passion. Mm-hmm. And that's great, But at some point, if it doesn't turn into a way to really, truly support himself totally autonomously, that's going to be challenging. My daughter is working in the medical field, and that's what she's wanted to do since she was little. As our kids are young, I'm saying, go ahead, follow your passion. But make sure that you recognize that that may not work out as the way to sustain yourself longer term. My daughter will be in the medical field. She loves it. It's going to work out great for her because there's such a desperate need for physician's assistants, which is what she's going to do, and doctors and nurses. My son's working in music, and that may turn out to be really challenging. So while you're young, I say go for it. But at some point, if you're just following your passion and it's not helping you, helping support your life because you're not making enough money, that's really not great advice. So, I think that answers the question. The other bad advice that I hear all the time is, never give up. There are times, often actually, when giving up is absolutely the right thing to do, right? So we see that in software all the time. Like if we go and do an experiment with our customers on, a small segment of our customers doing an A/B test or some flight to see if something works, if we get a clear signal early on that the thing that we thought was going to be hugely impactful isn't, give up. Mm-hmm. Try the next thing. Move on to something else. Like, don't double down on the thing that's not working. Don't, if you're really trying to make it as a musician and 20 years into it, you still aren't able to make a living, you should have given up a long time ago, or at least gotten a different job and continue to do music on the side. But follow your passion and never give up can actually turn out to be really bad advice.
Do you think that there's some way to have an effective sensor that tells you, okay, this might be a good time to give up? Like, how do you, I know it's like ambiguous, but do you think you have some intuition around when someone probably has reached that threshold where they should maybe correct course and adjust what they're doing?
I don't know. I think you know it when you see it. And I think you have to listen to people who are giving you advice, and reach out to people for advice and mentors and things like that. I'd have to think more about it. I don't know when it comes to life. It's worked for me figuring out, what's working and what's not working. I think in terms of like software development, product development, you set clear objectives for your experiments. Mm-hmm. You here are the principles, here are the guardrails, here's what success looks like. And then you test against that, you measure the metrics in all the different testing that you're doing with new features or new ideas or, new flights that you're doing to come up with some, you're working on something for some piece of software or your app or your service. And you set clear success metrics. And if you're not achieving those, then you cut bait and you move on to something else, or you iterate and see if you can actually change the game. It's probably something like that for your life. Maybe for some people it does work to set goals. You set a goal and you say, if I'm not able to make this much money or be self-sufficient or achieve this XYZ thing within the next 2 years, then I'm going to cut bait and move on to something else. Mm-hmm. That's not the way I work. That's not the way I manage my life. But I think that could work for other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I find the analogy between iterative development in software and architecting a good life. I think that's a really interesting analogy. There must be some overlaps, and it's cool to hear you talk about that. We kind of touched on it earlier, but I'd like to focus on a slightly different aspect of this. Sure. I've heard a lot the quote, "You can't do it all." And on the other side of "you can't do it all," you also hear these encouragements to not necessarily limit yourself to one pursuit. And I think the fear that some people have when they consider doing a few things at once is maybe burning out, or maybe not being able to succeed in anything if you're spreading yourself too thin. Do you have any tips on how to pursue multiple interests while also not spreading yourself too thin?
For me, obviously, if you're trying to do 50 different things and each one of them requires a full-time effort, you're going to burn out. For me, having a few things that I'm interested in that I can rotate sort of even during the day. Like this morning I got up and I had to do a little bit of Ventana stuff with our website. So I did a little bit of that. Then I did a whole bunch of Microsoft and now I'm having this podcast with you. For me, doing a few different things is what keeps me from burning out. Because I think if I was doing one thing all the time, I would burn out on it. But given that I can take a break and go do something else or flex my mind in a different way, in a different context, that's what keeps me from burning out. But if I took on 3 or 4 more big projects that were especially outside of my day job, I would probably lose it.
I have like 2 more questions. I want to make sure that time-wise you're okay.
Yeah, I'm great. Yeah, no problem.
Going back to the conversation about how kids are often asked what they want to be when they grow up, do you think that there's anything inherent to our education system that dissuades people from pursuing a dynamic career like yours?
That's a good question. I don't know. You have a diverse education. You take different classes and you study different topics to kind of see what you want to do. But there's always that, what are you going to do? Like, pick one and go do it. And I think, that's fine for some people, but pick one and pick something that's going to help support you and make sure you're not dependent on others. So, you're making a good enough living to support yourself or your family or whatever. But that in and of itself, I think, can burn you out and isn't enough to... Ventana is a good example. I always wanted to build a brand. I always wanted to do more sales and marketing, and that's not what I do in my day job. So I wanted to start, instead of trying to find another job at Microsoft because I was so steeped in product development and that's where all my expertise was, I wanted to go and try something new on the side to scratch that itch. But I don't know, I do think that the traditional education system has a ton of flaws. We still have kids sitting in rows and in desks and listening to a teacher in the front of the room. I think there's some innovation that we do these days around group work and trying to tap into different modes of learning and whatnot. But I don't know. I haven't thought as deeply about that maybe as I could have. But I do think the education system needs a heck of a lot of reform. But I don't know. I do think there's still a lot in education of, pick something and go do that and keep that, that's your one career. Fine, but I think you should have a diversity of interests that you're pursuing in life, as long as, like you talked about earlier, you're not burning out.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I also think that it's interesting how this question kind of merges your past experiences with being a public school teacher and then just like how your career has unfolded. Do you at all miss those days of teaching in school?
I do miss it. It's a lot of work. It's so much more work to teach students in middle school, high school, like I did, than it is to work at Microsoft. And it is so poorly rewarded. Mm-hmm. My wife works way harder than I do, and she makes far less money than she should. Mm-hmm. I miss it. I love, interacting with kids, answering, listening to their questions, getting ideas from them, traditional teaching. And so what I try to do is I try to 3 or 4 times a quarter, sometimes less, but a few times a year, trying to get into a classroom. So like this Friday, I'm teaching a class at Santa Clara University on sustainable business. Oh, wow. The following Monday, I'm doing some sessions at our local charter school where my wife teaches on artificial intelligence. And so I try to get in the classroom often because I miss it, but I don't miss the fact that we weren't compensated relative to the amount of work anywhere near what we should be as teachers, or what I should have been as a teacher. Not me personally, but just the career in general isn't well compensated, and it should be.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not very familiar with the compensation structure, but I've definitely heard this a lot. And I know that teachers work incredibly hard. So yeah, it's interesting to hear your perspective on that. Just as a closing question, if someone who's listening to this feels like they haven't quite found one job, one hobby, or one passion that satisfies their goals and gives them fulfillment, and they wanted your advice, what would you share with them?
I'll talk about mental health for a minute. I think sometimes people that haven't found their passion maybe just aren't passionate about anything because they have this is probably going to come out totally wrong, and I don't mean it to sound like I think it's going to sound, but there may be depression, there may be some underlying mental health issue that causes them to not find enjoyment in a lot of what's out there, or what, in anything. And the reason I say it is because that was me. We haven't talked about it yet, but I have something called cyclothymia, which is a form of bipolar disorder. And so it's marked by some pretty significant depression at times. And I know during those times, like even the things that I'm quote unquote passionate about, I didn't care about at all. And so sometimes I wonder whether people that say, I haven't found my passion, I'm not passionate about anything, I don't really care about anything, or it's more because there may be some underlying mental health issue. And the only reason I say that is because I know that's true for me. I'm on medication that's worked super, super well. And so that's helped a tremendous amount. But so that's one way to think about it. The other one is, I don't know, keep trying different things until you find something. Right? Like I didn't start surfing until late in life. I didn't start trying to play guitar until 7 months ago. I constantly trying to do new things to see if there may be other things out there that I could be passionate about. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps. And that's also a really meaningful perspective to hear. As you bring up mental health, I'm just curious if there's anything that you wish people who might be going through some mental health challenges would keep in mind as they move forward in their life and their career. Like, is there anything that you've learned during your journey with mental health that you wish you knew earlier?
At least in my world, there's not much stigma about it anymore. And I talk about it openly often. And I don't know how it is at other companies. I'm assuming that in some places, maybe even the military, maybe police, mental health can be a challenging thing to admit. And it could actually negatively impact your career in some ways. But at least in my experience at Microsoft specifically, we are super empathetic about those kinds of things. We know that it's a high stress environment and that people tend to, can burn out or have depression or have issues that arise throughout their life. And we've got terrific programs. I mean, I think it was the Microsoft Cares program that I first reached out to when I knew that I needed to deal with some of my own mental health issues, that got me through referrals to psychologists and psychiatrists that ultimately, help find the right medication that could help. And so I'm super open about it, in part because I think when you look at me on my life on the surface, it's the traditional definition of success, right? Like the wife, we've been together forever. We have a great marriage. There's no infidelity. I've got 2 great kids, live at the beach, the white picket fence, the vacation house and the mountains, and great salary, and like all the stuff that you look at on the surface and you go, wow, David's successful. The reality is, sure, I mean, that's all true, but it's not easy all the time. There's a lot of stress. There's, having this form of bipolar makes it really, really hard sometimes. And I want people to understand that what you see on the surface may not really be what's, the full reality, and that there is no stigma in admitting that you need help, in having a mental illness, in getting help, in maybe even being medicated. Like pharmaceuticals work great for me. And so I'm pretty open about it, just because I think we do have a mental health crisis in the US, and I think people need to be willing to get help and understand that it's not, the stigma isn't there like it used to be. That's me. Like, I know that in some families, people don't, believe in pharmaceuticals, or they don't want to admit that there's a problem and that everybody's supposed to just suck it up and, muddle through it. But I think things are changing, and I hope that helps a little bit. But the short of it is, I'm open about it because I hope that others realize that being open about it can actually help.
Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate that. And I think that the fact that things are changing in a positive direction is in large part attributed to people being willing to be vulnerable and just share their experience. And also, I imagine it's inspiring to just hear that even though you have these difficulties in your life, you're still, as you described, like massively successful in conventional ways and less conventional ways. So definitely appreciate you sharing all this.
Thanks.
Yeah. And from my perspective, I mean, those were the questions that I was excited to explore with you. Is there anything else? Like, I mean, assuming that people in the audience, some of them might be going through some meaningful transition in their life. Others are just excited about a bunch of different things and hoping to incorporate them in their life. Anything that I haven't asked or that we haven't touched on that you'd want someone listening to take away?
I think the big thing is trying to figure out what you're good at and do more, do better, learn more in that area, as opposed to trying to find the thing that you're really terrible at and getting better at it. That would be my main advice. And all that said, I recognize that I'm very privileged. I grew up in a great household. We didn't struggle for money, and I've had this amazing life. And I think that makes it easier for me. And I know other people don't have that. It doesn't mean you give up, but I also recognize that some of the advice I've given may not always be perfect for everyone else, because I have grown up in a pretty privileged environment, and I recognize that. And we've always wanted our kids to understand that too, which is one of the reasons why we've done some travel, just so that they recognize it's not like that for everybody and appreciate what you have.
Yeah, cool. I really appreciate you sharing everything that we talked about today. It's an honor to chat with you and to learn from you, and I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.